So step by step, we're making progress. What we're not able to do is enter a number. Well, I guess technically we can enter a number if we kind of find the input field. Here it is. But it's not much fun to search for it. Would be nicer if you could see it, wouldn't it? So therefore, let's style that input field, that text input field here a little bit. And just as before, actually, I want to do that in a separate component. So in the components folder, I'll add my own input.js file. And in there, as always, import React from React, and then import text input from React Native. And here I'll actually not need the view because we'll just have the text input here and style and configure that in there. And then have the input constant here, which is our functional component, which we in the end also export, of course. And well, one thing we'll need for sure is the style sheet, because that should now be styled here so that we have one default input look we could reuse in this application if we needed multiple inputs in different places. And that's really the mindset you have to get into. Create reusable components so that you don't have to copy code around or repeat yourself, but that you can easily share your components and easily create the apps you want from your set of building blocks you create on your own in the end. So here my styles object with style sheet create, like that, looks good. And now in that component, I want to return a text input, so this built-in text input. Now, of course, my idea is that we can style it from in here. So let's assign a style from in there. But just as with the card, it would be nice if we could also set some styling from outside, like a special width or a special border, anything like that. To enable that, again, I'll pass an object here to style. And for one, take all my styles set up in my styles object. And there, let's say, in an input property, which we have yet to add. And in addition, also add all styles we're getting from props style, so that we could set styles from outside as well. And now down there in the style sheet, we can add the input style to, well, assign some styles to the input. So here we could give this a height of, let's say, 30, which should be a height that looks relatively good. And to see something, I also want to add a border at the bottom. You could also add a border around the entire input with border color and border width and so on. But I like that look where we only have a border below the input. But that's, of course, totally subjective and something you can set up according to your personal preferences. A border at the bottom only can be set with border bottom color, and there I'll go with gray, another pre-built color which we can use with that shortcut, and give this border bottom also a width here of 1. Add a margin vertical of 10 to have some spacing around the input, at least to the top and bottom. And now with that, the base styling for this text input is done. Now let's use that in the game screen. So in there, I want to import my own input from the components folder, input, like that, and replace this text input here with my own input, which in the end wraps this built-in text input, of course. So use my own input, get rid of the text input import up there, which we don't need anymore. And now if we save this, we see it a little bit, but it's very, very small. You can barely see it here on iOS. And it gets bigger as you type, though, which is certainly not what we want, of course. We're, of course, not done. Instead, to style the width, I'll go to the Start Game screen, so to the place where we use the input, and set up the styling here. Because for me, it makes sense that we have some general styles, which we always want, in the input component, something like the height or the border. But some specific styles, like how big should it be, so how broad should it be, that's something you want to set up in the place where you actually use it. And therefore here, I'll add this input property in the Start Game screen style sheet object, and maybe use a width of 50 pixels here. That should look good. And assign that to my custom input here with the style prop. So there we can now point at styles.input. And with that, it will be having that width at all times. And if we type there, we don't make that broader anymore. Instead, we can then simply scroll automatically in that input. Now for this specific input, for this specific layout here, it would also be nice if the text would be centered, I think. For most inputs, you want that default behavior of writing from left to right and starting on the left edge. But here I think some centered text would be nice. And therefore, in Start Game Screen, where I want to have this centering here, on this input, we can also add the text align property and set this to center. And now this will center this text here in the middle as we type. And that's really nice for just entering a number then, like this. Speaking of that, right now we can enter anything in there. So we certainly need to configure this input. And for that, if I go to the input component where we use the text input, there is a lot of stuff we can configure there. And actually the best resource, as always, of course, is the official documentation. There in the API docs, if you go there and you search for the text input, you'll find not only an explanation, but you'll also find all the props you can set there. And you can set things like, is it multi-line or not? How long may the text be? You can also set a placeholder text. You can set auto-correction and all that fun stuff. So definitely check these docs to find the specific property you might need for your use case. I want to be able to set these props, but I want to be able to set them from the place where I use my custom input. So not from in here, because that would make sure that we use the same configuration for all inputs we might have in our app. I want to have more flexibility and just set up some base styling in here and configure the input in the place where we then use it instead of in the core wrapper component. The cool thing is React, and that's not React Native, that's just React and normal JavaScript, has a syntax for that. You can take your props you're getting and spread them on your component like this. The syntax might look a bit strange, but what it in the end does is it takes all the props you have, all the props you set here, and basically adds them to your component as props. Now, if you thereafter define other props like style, and you already got a style here, this style will override the style you got here. And that's actually what I want, because if I set a style prop on my own input from outside, I definitely want to override it with this style prop and add this styling which is set up down there to this text input. But if you set other props outside of this component, so on my custom component, then they will be added to the text input. And that allows us to add all the props we can add on the text input also on our input, so on our own component. So here where we use input, we can now not only add the style, but we can also add blur on submit, for example, to make sure that when we press the submit button there, we lose focus and we close the soft keyboard. We can set auto capitalize to none, which is one of the allowed values there. If you check the docs, you can set it to none, sentences, words, and so on. So I don't want to have capitalization turned on here because we'll just enter a number, but also because I want to show you different configurations you can set. I'll set autocorrect here to false so that we're not autocorrecting the user input. And very important here, I'll set the keyboard type to numeric so that the user has to enter a number here. I'll set the max length here to 2 so that you may only enter 2 digits and not a very long number, because this game here, it's just one of the restrictions I have here, is that this game only works with a 2-digit number. With all of that set up, now if you go back and I toggle my soft keyboard, you see you get that number keyboard here, and you can only enter 2 digits there, and not more than that, which is of course exactly what I want. In addition, here on Android we see this, if you click the confirm button, this will close it. That's thanks to that blur on submit thing. On iOS, such a button doesn't exist here, so there we'll actually have to find a different solution for closing this if you tap somewhere else, for example, because right now that's not happening. But the good thing is we now have a keyboard we can see and a keyboard where we can enter numbers. One thing I want to change though is that right now I can also enter a decimal separator here. Now to get rid of that, you can change the keyboard type to number pad. And to see all available keyboard types, as always, the official docs are the place to go. There for the text input, you can dive into keyboard type and find out what you can set, what works on all platforms, and what you could set if you would have a check that checks on which platform you are running the code, which we haven't learned about yet. Number pad is supported on both platforms though. And if you set this, you now have an input where you can't enter a decimal place here. If you type in here, you can't do it on iOS. On Android, you unfortunately can though. So there we'll also have to find a different fix.